So the last panel that we have for you guys is something that I'm very passionate about, which is media and narrative and the power that really has real life consequences. We've talked about how it can divide people or bring people together. We'll talk about the way the media is set up now and how it's often disempowering and how we can change that to be a force for mobilization and real life tangible impacts through that. So my four panelists are all in media from different angles. And so we're just gonna get right into it. The first question for you, Sean Blackman, is just kind of set us up with the structure of the way media works. Because if you look at what it's structured to do or who it's powered by, then you're not so surprised. I mean, as you guys know, I've worked in journalism and what you'd call mainstream journalism for over a decade. And I know there was issues of bias. And but when it came to the way the conflict in Ethiopia was covered, I think, Nebi, you said it, just outright lies. Completely ignoring certain data points, exaggerating other data points. So let's try to break it down a little bit. Sean, why is coverage of the African continent and African people everywhere, including here, the way that it is?
Well, thank you so much, Hermela. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this great event for having us, and I want to thank all of you for spending your Sunday evening with us. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're right here with us. As you've heard, my name is Sean Blackman. I am the co-host of By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C., which I have the pleasure of hosting with Mrs. Jackie Lukman Nation. And I'm also an organizer with the Answer Coalition, which stands for Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. And it's important to point out both because when I make these comments tonight, I'm not coming at it from the standpoint of someone like Anderson Cooper or Don Lemon or who's the lady on MSNBC? Rachel Maddow, Tucker Carlson, or Roland Martin. No, I'm coming at this from the standpoint of an African whose blood flows from the cotton fields of South Alabama, who's an anti-imperialist organizer who just so happens to host a daily radio show. And that's important because what we do Monday through Friday, 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we don't do to build a platform or to build an audience, and certainly not to build a brand. We're doing it to build a movement. And that's really the thrust of what I want to get across this evening. Media as movement building, right? And so to answer Hermela's question, we really have to fundamentally understand how media operates in this country to understand why we see and read what we see and read. Now, the United States loves to tell the world that it is a haven of the free press. Free press, that's the phrase they use, right? And will even wag their finger at other countries for supposedly not having a free press themselves. Let me tell you something about the media in this country. The press in the United States, it's a lot of things. Free ain't one of them, right? The reality is 90% of the media in this country is controlled by just 6 companies. 6. Last I checked, it was AT&T, CBS, Comcast, Disney, Viacom, and News Corp. So what does that mean? That means that the news that goes out to millions of people in just this country alone is decided by about 232 media executives. Oh, and by the way, the collective wealth of those 6 companies is over $400 billion. And so the point I'm making is that there is a clear and explicit class character to the media in the United States, and there's also a political character. And the interests of the folks who control the media, their interests are diametrically opposed to ours, right? And so we see the corporate press in the United States, and I would extend that to the West as a hemisphere, it's a bullhorn for imperialism. It is a warlike press. It is a hawkish press. It is a racist press. It is an anti-worker press. But they tell you and I that they're fair and balanced and objective, and that they're preaching the quote-unquote truth. And so the orientation, the position of the people who control the media, who give us these images of the African continent, right? And who give us this messaging, they are of the same mindset of the Europeans that carved up the African continent centuries ago. And so we're dealing with these same elements, these same dynamics of white supremacy, capitalism. And out of that capitalism grows this imperialist global system, right? And so anything happening in the world that contradicts the interests of Washington, anything that contradicts the interests of the wealthy minority that control the media, it has to be either whitewashed or pushed aside, swept under the rug, and as we know, outright lied about. We saw this happen in real time in the issue in Ethiopia. But we've also seen it recently. Just the other day, y'all remember when those missiles hit Poland, killed 2 people? The Associated Press, considered to be one of the most legitimate media platforms in this country, reported that those were Russian missiles that struck Poland, even though that had not been confirmed, had not even been investigated. Now, why is that dangerous? Because we know Poland is a NATO country. This could have triggered that Article 5, and we very well could have been in the midst of World War III, all because these people didn't do their due diligence as journalists. This is the danger of an imperialist press. Because this same class of people that want to keep us in this seemingly never-ending cycle, these forever wars, all this death, all this destruction, all this bloodshed, all this famine, all this poverty, all this humanitarian crisis, right? The same imperialists that set those issues in motion are the same ones that supposedly are telling you and I the truth about what's happening around the world and indeed in our communities. And so I'll end there, but just to reiterate that we can never make the mistake of thinking that imperialism's issues are ours or that their enemies are ours. I was watching an old clip the other day. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen it. It was of Nelson Mandela. And, some journalist was asking him, well, why are you so friendly with, Fidel Castro of Cuba and Yasser Arafat of Palestine? And in a nutshell, Mandela was like, well, they're our friends. They spilled blood in our land fighting apartheid, right? And so he understood that we have to decide who our friends are and who our co-strugglers are and who our enemies are. It's not decided by the U.S., it's not decided by the West or anything else. And so when we talk about shifting narratives, you and I have to be very cognizant of that and not fall victim to the lies of the same system that has been bleeding us dry for centuries.
Wow, yeah, what an introduction. Thank you for that, Sean. Jackie, now, I'm curious, and oftentimes in the media, of course, we see that there's this binary that folks are putting into the narrative, right? There has to be one good guy and one bad guy, but obviously the real problem seems to be a lot more complicated and a lot more nuanced. So why is that? How in ways do imperialism and the media intersect in that way? What are they trying to do?
Well, you know, the media, the U.S. Western media, is very good at giving us a good guy, bad guy, you know, good country, bad country, a good versus evil narrative, where the good is always presented as either the United States or whatever government or country the United States supports. That's almost always the case. I think we can say always the case. And as someone who is first African, it concerns me not that my my lineage comes from Greenville County, Virginia. I know that my ancestors were dropped off on these shores from the continent of Africa. So my first alliance is to Africans, is to the continent of Africa. And what is this country that was complicit in the reason that my ancestors were dropped off on these shores? What is their stake in this narrative that they're giving us about Africa? And I found that it's never good. The stake has been, it has never been they're telling an unbiased story about whatever is going on the continent of Africa. And also, they never tell the truth, the U.S. government, I mean, and the Western media, which are really just scribes for the State Department and the MI5 over in the UK and whatever the German equivalent of that is, and, you know, their allies. They never tell the truth about their role in whatever conflict they're reporting on. So whenever they talk about unrest in Ethiopia, and they want us to take a side between, you know, one government or this group of people, and who the government leader is and the group of people doesn't even matter. Because the truth is that by setting up this binary, which is a false binary, by the way, of good versus evil, bad leader versus good leader, the U.S. government and its scribes are obscuring the role that the United States government, the State Department, NATO, and AFRICOM have played in creating the conflict they're reporting on. So we have to continually push back on the narrative that comes from U.S. media, particularly about conflicts on the continent or anywhere else in the world. Whenever they prop up someone who is supposed to be the most evil person that exists, that the U.S. is there to stop, we should immediately ask, what's the United States doing behind this that they don't want us to ask the questions about? So I think that's our role.
Thank you. Very good. So I want to come to you, Kamal. So, you know, the reason I'm very passionate about media, I'll be kind of like a pseudo fifth panelist on this one, is that it really has the power to either give you the tools you need to change your life or the people around you, or it does the opposite. It can be completely disempowering. So the narrative that you believe about yourself or the people around you or your community or other communities really has a tangible impact. And Kamal, you're a co-founder of Black Power Media, and in its mission, it says that it's established to challenge the narrative about Black politics and Black condition. And also with that, you're one of the founders, or the founder of Community Movement Builders, which actually is in the community supporting people. So how can media be, or what is media now in terms of whether it empowers or disempowers, and how can we change that to help Black people and African peoples take control of their lives?
Thank you for that, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here. So when we talk about media and its role, particularly its role in Black folks, we have to think about, as folks have mentioned here, what is the purpose of media? Whether or not that's media that's corporate owned or media that's independent, right? What is the narrative that media is giving you? Our media at Black Power Media is giving you this narrative, that the United States government has been, is now, and forever will be an enemy of Black people in the United States and African people on the continent. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That is the role of the United States vis-a-vis Black folks vis-a-vis poor folks. And that is the narrative that we have to make sure that we are clear that we are giving you. That the United States will never come free us because it is only here to enslave us. The role of mainstream or corporate media, mainstream is a term, an unfortunate term we should not be using. The role of corporate media is as what our fellow panelists have already stated. But I want to give you some particulars about what it is that we are saying to you about what corporate media does when it talks to us. The corporate media we all consume, right? The corporate media that we are enwashed of, right? We bathe in it. We swim in it. We cannot get away from it. It shapes our views from infancy until our death. And we wind up parroting these views without even knowing it, without investigation, as folks say, without study. Even those of us like myself who claim to be, I've kicked the crack habit of corporate media. Every now and then, I got to stop myself from saying, I think they're saying that those folks must be bad. It's like, no. I got to go read something more. I can't rely on CNN. So quickly, this is the role of corporate media in our lives. One, violence is not violence when it is practiced by the West. Nothing the West ever does is termed as violent. It could drop bombs on people in Japan, as it has, right? No other nation has ever used nuclear weapons, but yet it's never called violence. It could kill 6 million people in the country of Vietnam, but it's never called an invasion, an overthrow. It can attack Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan. It can put bases all around the world, but it's never done for violence. But if you pick up a stick, a rock, if you push, if you shove, you are committing violence against the West and or its institutions. And that goes for the same thing here at home. When the police kill black people, even in the most horrific ways, it's played down. There's a rationale for it. We investigate the past of the person who was killed. If you go to a precinct as a black person and march and rally, you have to state that you're there for peaceful purposes. You have to align with the ideology that's given to you. How dare you even think about your right to self-determination and self-defense? You're not allowed that. That's what's taught to you by the corporate media. Two, capitalism is good. Capitalism is always good. Capitalism, the ownership of resources, the means of production by private corporations is innately good, and you cannot question it. Because if you question it, you are, of course, a communist or a socialist. And there's nothing wrong with being those things. But it's been so demonized here that you could never even get out another word. If you question the fact that the making of an economy is controlled by small individuals in organizations that are non-democratic, who have total power to hire, fire people, to destroy lives, then you are a communist. You can never question capitalism. On its face, it's good for humanity according to corporate media. How many countries are under the capitalist system? How has it been good for those countries? What is the state of Africa as a predominantly predominantly capitalist continent? What is the state of Asia? The state of South America? What is the state of Europe? And what is the state of the United States under capitalism? There are few who are rich and many who are poor, but do not question it, because capitalism is good according to Western media. The United States and the West, they make mistakes, but they're never doing it with an evil intent. There's never any wrongdoing. You must understand that. So when the United States drops drones on weddings and gatherings, it's only mistake. It's not meant to terrorize the larger public at bay, at May. When the United States develops programs that murder and kill activists and organizers and labor unions, when they train military officers of other countries to do the same in their country, there's only mistakes made. It's never a purposeful strategy. And of course, those mistakes are only mistakes when they come to the public eye. Because they're never going to be admitted unless someone takes a picture, has a video, somehow is able to testify. But you have to remember, the United States and the West is never committing terrorism. It's never terrorizing. It only makes mistakes. And so when it kills thousands of people, if not millions of people, through sanctions, those are only unfortunate incidents to a larger, greater good, which you may not understand. But if you watch corporate media, and if that's where you get your daily dose of understanding, then that, of course, is what you will know. The United States and Western Europe is a rule-based system, which means it's their rules, and their rules are the fair rules. They are objective. You cannot question the objectivity of it. So when folks here talked earlier about the Marshall Plan, and they looked upon the Marshall Plan as something that potentially could be used for Africa, or we discussed it in such a way. Well, that's not what the Marshall Plan was, even in Europe. The Marshall Plan was a way to reestablish European economies so that the United States would have someone to trade with, including Germany and Japan, who they just recently destroyed. How was it going to do that? By taking out loans from the United States, as mentioned, but also by recolonizing, post-World War II, all of the colonies that the Axis powers were no longer in control of. So the reason you had a Vietnam War, the reason you had colonialization continue on the continent to the extent that it did, was because the Marshall Plan was, how do we reestablish the dominance of European capitalism over the world? That's what the Marshall Plan was. But what you're taught in school is that the Marshall Plan saved Europe and saved the world. Lastly, as Jackie mentioned, the Western media is here to tell us who our friends are and who our enemies are. So one day, Ethiopia was a friend of the United States, and then it wasn't. Iraq was a friend of the United States, and then it wasn't, and then it was again. Iran was a friend of the United States, and then it wasn't. So your enemies and friends, Russia was for a brief time also a friend of the United States post the Soviet Union, and then it wasn't again. So we have to understand that the moment the U.S. system of media operations tells you and I that someone is our enemy, you need to do all you can to investigate about what's going right in that country. What is it that you need to do to duplicate the efforts that have made these people the enemies of the United States and of Western Europe? Because that means that these people are really fighting for freedom, that they're really trying to liberate. And it may not always be on the terms in which you and I appreciate, but it does mean it's worthy of further investigation. So I'll wrap up quickly with, I just wanted to name again some of the things in terms of a media narrative that we have to understand what happens both here and in Africa. And I think these things have been mentioned. I wrote them down based on what folks have said today, and I'm going to run through it really quickly. This is the media narrative from the West to us about Africa, that is full of dictators, that is underdeveloped, that is full of bribery, that is primitive, that is corrupt, that is war-torn, that is uncivilized, that is food insecure. Here's the media narrative for black people to Africans, either in the continent or in the diaspora when they come here, right? And the diaspora, particularly the ones who came here, not those of us who were brought here, I'm talking about in particular. That we are lazy, that we need to pull ourselves up our bootstraps because we don't take advantage of all our opportunities here, that we're violent, that we are full of criminals, that we complain right? And that we're down with the imperialist project. That's the media narrative that's fed to you both on the continent and as newcomer Africans here in the United States to keep us apart. So we have to watch the media because, as stated at the beginning of my talk, the United States is an enemy, has been an enemy, and will be an enemy of African people, both on the continent and here at home. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kamal. We'll move over to Karanja. So Karanja, you're Kenyan, living in the US, and you've had several different jobs. It's very interesting. You've had several different lives almost. So you worked in the first Obama campaign. You've also been a leading, it's okay, it's okay.
We all grow, sorry.
So,
Why would you throw me under the table?
It's all right, just own it. It led you here. So you've also been a leading organizer in Occupy Wall Street, and I just think it's so interesting, the evolution that you had that you and I talked about. First, you were anti-economic inequality, and you thought that would naturally fix the systemic racism issues, and then you became anti-racism, and then you ultimately became what you are now, which is anti-imperialism. So what did that road look like, that evolution look like, and how does it inform your work now, which is fighting stereotypes of African people and Africa?
I don't know if I would necessarily want to go into the whole journey, but yes, I did start out in Occupy Wall Street, and you know, I guess the one thing that was really useful from there was learning about narrative and the changing of narrative. And yes, I did start out believing this Obama mantra that a rising tide lifts all boats, or whatever boat. You know, and of course I was quickly disabused of that. I did grow up in Kenya, so you know, American racism is quite what's the word? It's quite the conundrum.
Yeah, tricky.
Yeah, it's taken me all of my full 20 years here, really, for it to sink in. And for that to then connect to the struggle, my struggle of imperialism and my struggle of, I don't want to call it struggle, my fight against narrative and against imperialism. And yes, one of the things that I found at Occupy was that these radical white kids that I was working with were racist as all F, you know, and I was like, I remember just thinking, like, you people are irredeemable. Like, what the hell? Like, and so, so moving on from there, you know, I left that fight. It was very clear that there is no rising tide that will raise all boats, because the project of American racism is deeply, deeply ingrained in everything to do with America, in American government, in American society, and it's deliberate, it's by design. I often say that American slavery, America was formed on slavery, and it has never let go of slavery. Slavery was not abolished, it was simply outsourced, primarily to Africa, but to the global South in general. Slavery continues in exactly the same form that it existed in the 1800s here in this country, save for the shackles and save for the Americans actually going and shipping slaves over here, which actually, by the way, slavery today is much cheaper for the American government because it's outsourced, right? They don't have to actually do the work of feeding slaves. They don't have to do the work of housing and clothing slaves. What else would you call the kids mining coltan in DR Congo? And not just in DR Congo, but even kids working, living and working in Kenya in the slums, like quite clearly, there's no difference in their condition than what we saw. I remember watching Roots when I was in Kenya and weeping for Kunta Kinte, and it didn't register at the time that there really was no difference between the material conditions of people in Kibra, some of the biggest slum in Kenya, and Kunta Kinte. So American slavery was just outsourced. So it brought me to where I am today, which is about challenging narratives about Africa. And one of the things that is really, really useful in challenging narratives is language. And so as long as we're using their language, as long as we're using English, French, all of these languages that we communicate with each other in, we are at a disadvantage. And one of the flyers here, I was looking at it, and it has, for example, the Ujima People's Progress Party, and one of the things that they do is fight gentrification and building economic justice. Well, what is gentrification? Gentrification means to improve. So white people are talking about, when they refer to gentrification, they're talking about their improving neighborhoods. When black people, when Africans are talking about gentrification, we are actually really talking about displacement. But that's not the word we use because we are using their language. And one of the stories that I always tell about narrative and the importance of language is, for example, that in Kiswahili, the word for a white person is mukaburu, which means colonizer. It is so unambiguous. It leaves you with no doubt, no question about who you're dealing with, who you're talking about, right? And so there is power in using our own language. And so the project of disabusing us of everything to do with our humanity, our languages, our, the dehumanization is so complete. And so we really have to be challenging constantly the narratives that are told us. The United States is indeed the number one terrorist organization on the planet. It is a mafia organization. The United States' number one export is war and the implements of war. Like, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Like, and the narratives that they use to sell that, as others on the panel have talked about, is that when so-called collateral damage happens, it's purely by accident, right? But the United States was formed right from the beginning with, the United States has always been really good at PR. Hollywood is PR for the United States. At the very foundation, this country, this government has always been really good at using impeccable words while masking deplorable acts. For example, starting with the words, all men are created equal, spoken by a slave owner, right? And the crazy thing is that those words continue to be repeated without any sort of challenging or questioning of who this person was that wrote them, and so we sort of still hail these people. I choose not to commit to memory, well, I guess I know who it was, but I choose to refer to him simply as a slave owner, because that's what he was, right? And so that is the importance of narrative, using language that is very unambiguous about describing who you're describing.
Thank you. I'm going to add a line. Just a line about what Karanja just said, how important it is that we find our own way to talk about things in our own words. Gentrification is, just even in the English language, as he mentioned, gentrification is a word that came from, the other end, and Kamal touched on this, mainstream media. If we keep calling it mainstream media, then what are we, just the alternative, right? So that's something that I want to also just emphasize as well. And then we're going to go around a little bit more, and we're going to wrap up this panel.
Yeah, so y'all really did a great job in setting up what the purpose of corporate media is, Western media in general, and how destructive it is, right? Now I'm curious, Sean, if you can kind of get into the role of social media now, and is it helpful? Is it hurtful? I feel like we've had this conversation a lot in the past few years, post-COVID, I guess. So now, yeah, you can really talk to some of the downsides, the limitations as it relates to organizing.
Yeah, thank you, Yoleon. Yeah, I got a lot of strong opinions about social media. The first thing we always got to remember is that when we talk about these social media platforms, these tech companies, because that's what they are, we're talking about capitalist institutions. They exist to make money, right? They don't exist because Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey really wants you to reconnect with that dude you knew in 5th grade or whatever, right? And the reason that we can use these platforms for free is because we are the product, right? And that's why they designed them to literally be addictive. That's why you can be on Facebook and literally have an endless conversation with just response after response after response. It's why on Twitter you can have these endless threads. It don't matter that it's only however many characters, right? Because the longer they can get you to stay on there, the more data they can pull from you so they can advertise to you and try to sell you stuff, right? So that's one thing that's important to remember about like literally why they exist. It's also important to remember that social media is a funhouse mirror reflection of reality. And the things that get so much engagement, because that's the name of the game, right? Engagement. The things that get so much engagement, if you didn't know any better, you would swear that people in real life and in the real world are actually concerned about these things. But that's just not necessarily the case. And I mean, I'm sure if you're on social media, you see all the times just these very like, frankly irrelevant, esoteric arguments and conversations, and you know, and then there's the cyclical topics that get talked about seemingly every week and a half and stuff like that. And it might be 20 people talking about this stuff, right? But because of the algorithms and how people are responding to it and retweeting it and stuff like that, you would really think that whatever it is just a really relevant and substantive issue in the world. And so we have to always remember that we can't let these platforms dictate what's real to us, right? We always have to always be firmly rooted in reality. So I want to also say that social media has a utility, right? It can be a great place to amplify our media, our information, our political education materials. We can amplify events like the one we have today. Social media can be a tool to help amplify a movement, but you can't build a movement on social media. You know what I mean? And there's absolutely no substitute for this, person-to-person, real-life sort of connection, discussion, and building. There's no substitute for that. And I see far too many people who are content to just stay in that social media bubble. And it's tempting because on social media, you can have the best, most pure politics in the world. And it's so easy because you don't ever have to test your politics. You don't ever have to do trial and error. On social media, your opinions don't matter at all. You see what I mean? And so if people aren't careful, they can mess around and be put in a state of demobilization to where you're sending a tweet and think that you're organizing or doing activism. But that ain't it, y'all. We can utilize the thing, but under no circumstances can we let it become the engine or the heart of what we do. Because as we see, that thing can be so easily taken away. We've mentioned today about the folks just in this room who have had their accounts taken like that. And why? Because they were threatening somebody? Because they were doxing someone, putting their address or whatever on the internet? No. Because they had the audacity to express a politic and an analysis that doesn't square with the whims of Washington. And this is the last thing I want to touch on that note, because these tech platforms work in collusion with the state to suppress political dissent. And the issue of the No More movement is just one example of that. And I give you another example. You know, me and Jackie, we do By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik. That's Russian state media. And if you click that, and it's true for Iranian, you know, Press TV, CGTN, whatever it is, if you click that little link, it gives you an explanation about just what that means. And Twitter says that they give this designation to people who don't have an independent editorial line because it's tied to a government. But BBC and NPR don't count, and they name them specifically. And that really struck me because nobody from Twitter reached out to us anyway to ask who determines our editorial line or who decides what stories that we discuss or what topics that we talk about or what perspective that we can have. So they made no investigation into the reality of not just our show, but of Radio Sputnik in general. They decided that we were illegitimate or that we were pushing, quote, disinformation. You see what I mean? This is what I talk about with these tech platforms colluding with the state. And so that's another reason why we can never root ourselves in the platforms. We have to root ourselves amongst our people and in our communities and in our class, because that is going to be the thing that really sustains us and really help us to accomplish what it is that we know needs to be done.
Thank you. Jackie, you're co-host of By Any Means Necessary, which was deplatformed. You know, I'm not an expert on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but I was surprised to see how quickly RT, Russia Today, and other platforms were literally removed off the internet. You could not reach them in the U.S. Or there was a time in that period that if you wanted to share a song on Instagram, like while posting a photo, it would say this song is not available in certain countries, and it was related to a conflict. Mm-hmm. So you'd have like a Beyonce song that was not allowed to play in Russia because of the conflict. So it's really interesting the level of reach that the U.S. government has when it comes to media, but then our reporters go in front of leaders in the global South and then press them on press freedoms. So how important, and this is a little bit build off of what Sean said, how important or not important is social media, and what does that mean for gathering in spaces like this and the importance of that?
Yeah, I think that, you know, social media, as Sean said, has its utility, right? Like, as you said, By Any Means Necessary on Sputnik, all of the shows on Sputnik were deplatformed from all podcasting platforms. So we used to be able to find our shows on Spotify, on, you know, all of these Apple iTunes, and now nowhere. We are on none of these. So the views of two radical left black folks are hard to access all of a sudden, not because of anything we particularly said, which, you know, I still maintain that our line is correct, but just by virtue of the fact that we are employed by a company, the only media company in this country, I will say without equivocation, that would pay two black radical leftists to say what we want, to speak the truth. So the ability to amplify our voices and the voices of the people we talk to, movement folks, radical folks like us, people in the streets who are doing anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist organizing and work, who are fighting the system, Africans throughout the continent, voices from the struggle, telling us what is really going on, in these struggles that we're not hearing from mainstream media in the global South, social media is important in amplifying those voices because, yes, it is easy. It is easier through social media to hear the stories of what is really going on in these conflicts than it is without social media. And I think in that way, the advancement of political education has been a little bit better because of the advent of social media, because we can create a video and we can send it out and it can be viewed, seen by thousands of people, maybe millions of people around the world. However, there is the point that Sean made that I think we should never lose sight of, and that is the fact that the state, and when we say the state, we mean the United States government, but we specifically mean the CIA, the FBI, USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, all of these related front organizations that crush people's movements abroad and in the US, they not only co-opt these platforms, they have contracts with them. Or shall I say, the owners of these tech platforms that provide our social media outlets, they have contracts with the CIA, with the FBI, to provide surveillance of their platforms and to use their platforms' technology as a means of surveillance. So we have to be careful when we're using social media to amplify messages and the truth and the voices that are not being heard through corporate media. We have to be careful that we're not actually giving them information that they can turn around and use against us because that's what they're looking for. So we have to be careful that we're not doing our organizing on social media, that we're not telling them everything that we're doing, that we're not giving away all of our information on social media, but we have to be smart in how we strategically use it to counter this narrative that comes from U.S. corporate media. And I think this U.S. Africa Leaders Summit is a perfect example. Because if we are to believe what the U.S. government says, you know, this is a very benign and even positive event between the U.S. government and Africa leaders to foster, you know, a greater collaboration and economic development and you know, support for justice and democracy and whatever other lies that the U.S. State Department is telling about what they're doing in this summit. But it is through social media that brought a lot of you here, and it is also through social media that organizations like the Black Alliance for Peace are using to raise the contradictions that exist in this event, that the United States is not using this event to foster any goodwill on the African continent. It is using this event to expand and entrench the control of the U.S. government on the continent.
Exactly.
It is using this event to tell African leaders, whether they're comprador leaders or not, to tell them you will toe the U.S. line in your countries, and we will give you all the tools you need, whether it's whether it's money, whether it's U.S. weaponry, whether it's the deployment of AFRICOM troops to help your militaries to keep your people in line. And that's the U.S. government's idea of fostering democracy. That's what they mean. Keeping people's movements in line and quiet and not pushing against U.S. imperialism and the expansion of capitalism and neoliberal policies in their countries, which has already robbed people of their humanity. And as we have established, people are sick of that. So we can use social media to raise these contradictions about what that conference really is. And we have a whole list of activities through the entire week countering whatever it is they're talking about at this conference. But we can never, never believe that it is social media that is going to, on the ground, create the conditions, create the movements, and inspire people to in that kind of involvement on the continent. We need to do that through these kinds of activities. We can use social media to get people intrigued and involved. Oh, this is what's really going on? Oh, well, let me go check these people out and see what else they have to say that maybe I don't know about. And then when we get people in face-to-face, person-to-person conversations, that's where the movements are built. That's where organizing happens, not on social media. Social media is good for publicizing, but it should not be used for organizing. That's where that's our job. That's what we have to do.
Thank you for that, Jackie. So, Kamau, there's obviously, as you all know, that there's an entire industry dedicated to pumping out state-sponsored propaganda 24/7. What challenges have you had in building Black Power media, primarily because there really isn't as big of a network for support in that way? Like, what lessons have you learned in building any type of media platform for political education?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest either detriment or hindrance is what I mentioned earlier, is that we already come in with so many conclusions about what America is and what its purpose is. We buy into it. We assume the goodness of the United States even when we know better. Or, again, we create the own narrative in our heads that it's better than other places. And as was talked about earlier, that's just based on a lack of a good examination of what's happening in other areas. And he mentioned the movies. Like, there's so much we'll go home tonight and we'll sit back and watch a movie, and without even thinking about it, there's going to be some CIA good guy, white guy, who saves some hostage from some terrorist Arab nation, and we'll just watch that 1,500 times. And we've watched it all our lives. If it wasn't the cowboys, it wasn't the armies in World War II, if it's not some detective, propaganda as we call it sometimes, there's always an individualized white guy, sometimes white woman, sometimes black sidekick that is saving somebody's life, that makes us endeared to this sort of classical romance or great heroism story that puts us in a position of not going with our own common sense around what history quickly tells us and shows us, right? And so even when we read about the violations of our homelands and our current lands and the history of the United States, that stuff always gets put to a back burner once there's a good feel-good story on, right? Because that feel-good story has been there, right? It's been there. Again, it's told to us when, even in the places where we come from, when we get the movies from the United States, right? We get the space stories of the U.S. There's no black people in the future in space, right? That's only recent that that's happened. For the most part, it's just white heroes who come at us. So the issue is for us is building an audience who will listen to and understand and implement the ideas that they hear to counter the propaganda that they get day in and day out. And what is good propaganda? Propaganda is not hearing something once. Propaganda is that you hear it 50, 60, 70, it's a drumbeat. That's what propaganda is, right? So that's why the corporate media can tell you, if you say, you guys don't cover this, they'll point to one story they covered that talked to one person that gave an alternative point of view and tell you, look, we did cover it. But meanwhile, they've done 85 other stories that never included that person, that gave you the U.S. dominant point of view that they want you to hear. And then quickly, when we just to think about social media, I mean, just remember, right? Eritrea didn't win a war because people tweeted each other, right? Ethiopia didn't battle the Italians because somebody got on Facebook, right? The largest black organization ever developed in the world, the Garvey movement, didn't do it because it made TikTok videos, right? You don't need social media to organize. It is a tool, but we don't need it to organize. You are in the places that you need to be to organize, right here, right now. these are the places that you need to be. This is the place, maybe after this, you're going to listen now to By Any Means Necessary, and you didn't listen to it before. Maybe you tune in to Black Power Media for a couple of hours, and you'll hear things in ways that you didn't hear before, right? You'll put other people onto it. So, I mean, obviously, the social media, the work that you've done, I started looking at your channel now, to give the alternative views, the different views that we don't get, is that we got to spread it naturally. We got to let folks know about it, right? And they are there to inform our organizing and to inform our work.
Thank you. Once your consciousness is raised, watching a movie is a whole different experience. You can't enjoy it the same. You just know that's not the good guy. So thank you for that. So we'll wrap with Karanja. A lot of the work that you do is centered in fighting dehumanizing narratives. And so what is it that we should keep in mind in terms of the way that African peoples are talked about? And what can we do, or how can we engage with these stories differently that can help change that?
Well, the real problem, of course, with African narratives is that they're not told by Africans, right? And so that's why it's so important that we be the ones telling our stories. It's so true, and I struggled when I started coming around to this idea that African kids were drowning in the Mediterranean or in the Caribbean Sea trying to get to the United States. I really struggled with this notion that they're doing it for an iPhone and Jordans, right? Because it seems trite, it seems simplistic, but in reality, it's so true. African kids are selling land to then spend $4,000 or up to $10,000 even to cross the Sahara and then cross the Mediterranean. That is a huge chunk of change that you could start businesses with in our home countries. It does, because of narrative, because of this capitalist narrative, because of the Western narrative about how beautiful America is, and of course Eugene that 160 million Americans are struggling every week with expenses. This extreme hyper vulture capitalist narrative of America as the land of milk and honey is so attractive that people don't stop to think that, in my own country in Kenya, like the Maasai people, we consider them, well, I don't anymore, but people do consider the Maasai poor while they have like 400 head of cattle. Like this, and it's no different. Like the prices of cattle are no different. And by the way, these days we do live in a global village, in a global economic village where everything really just costs the same wherever you are. Whether you're in Nairobi, in Guinea, in Papua New Guinea, in New York, like this, the grocery stores, a lot of stuff costs the same and sometimes more, right? Because especially when this stuff is being imported, which is usually the case. Somebody else talked about, I forget who it was, I think it might have been Eugene, about the fact that Africans are not trading with each other, right? Like we're only trading with each other to the tune of about 15%. And that's insane because not only is it a market of 1.4 billion people, but it is a market that does consider, out of that 1.4 billion people, there's about 400 million to 500 million or so that's in the middle class and rising, right? And the middle class is expanding across Africa. I'm trying to stay on one thread of thought, but this capitalist selling of America has been so effective that we don't consider those things, right? That we trade primarily, we get on planes and go to Europe. Like I literally cannot, like, to travel to West Africa, to like French-speaking countries, for example, is near impossible. And so, forget the trade. And by the way, it's really expensive. Like the tolls between countries, like traveling from one part of Africa, truckers are paying up to $4,000 in tolls. That's insane. So it is deliberate, and we do have to challenge all of those narratives, and that's where we come in. I published The Brief Scoop, and one of the reasons that I'm determined and working towards making The Brief Scoop a continental newswire, and hopefully a Pan-African newswire when we are done, is because, again, you were talking about the 6 companies that own media. The AFP, by the way, which is also French government-owned, between the AFP, Agence France-Presse, the AP, Reuters, those 3 wires, they pretty much write all the stories. Never mind the fact that there's this 6 owners. Like the stories come from one, especially for the stories on Africa, right, and the global South in general, and the Caribbean. And so we do have to challenge these narratives. I could keep going on, so I'll yield there. I see Hamela. I talk about food sovereignty a lot, and I think Hamela wants to deal with her food sovereignty.
Too. Yeah. There's several panels
Your
that could
food
come
security
out of
tonight.
what we're doing.
There.
Yeah, right, exactly. Food security. No, thank you guys so much. Give it up for our last panelists: Sean Blackman, Jacqueline Lukman, Kamal Franklin, Karanja Gashesha. Thank you guys so much. I mean, this was really incredible. Thank you all for showing up. This forum was organized super last minute. I was actually looking back at threads to see how long ago this started. It was about 3 weeks ago. So really, this is amazing. There are people that have come out of state for this, and it's really a sign that we can do so much more. We're thinking about, maybe somebody suggested doing this quarterly, not waiting for a crisis or for another summit that we feel like we need to counter, just keeping this education and community going regularly.